I think you're about the only one left, so we need to hurry up and get you. So I'm hoping that I still have a little longevity, that this is not my last moments.
You can start it right now.
I have a birthday next week, and I'll be 73. So I guess the Lord promised us 70, so I'm on the other side of it. I had an aunt that used to say all the time, I'm working my way in, so I guess that's what I'm doing. I didn't see it quite in the questions, but 11 years ago I was walking around thinking I was physically in great shape, and I collapsed, and they took me over to University Hospital and found a large tumor on my spine. And so after the x-rays and MRIs and all of that, they established that if they left it on, it would take over my body. You know how the spine is the telephone cord of your body, and they have no idea really what will happen. But they said if they took it off, I would be paralyzed for the rest of my life. And the reason I'm saying this, I always feel it puts people at ease to know why you're in a wheelchair. I like to, it's not I'm so telling the story, but it kind of lets you know how I got here. And they told me I would never stand and walk again. And I went into a very intense therapy. And about 4 years after that, I was up and I was actually walking. And I was out to the getting some more therapy, and as the therapist was bringing me out to pool, he dropped me and broke both my legs, and it triggered everything back again. So this time they said, this is it, you're not going to walk again. And about a year ago, one morning, every morning, you know, by being a minister, you know, I'm still, you know, dealing with the Lord's going to get me out of his chair. So every morning I test see if maybe the angels came in while I was sleeping and I was going to jump out the bed. And so that particular morning, I hadn't been able to move my legs. And that morning, I was able to move them back. So I called Cleveland Clinic and told them, you know, I got some movement. What? And that's impossible. I said, well, I have it. So I went over and they said, well, I'll tell you what, there's a new medication. Our class, we put it in only once a year. And we're going to try that and maybe we'll see what's going to happen. So they gave me that, and I waited a year. It went back, this was about November, and they told me, listen, we're on the 5th floor, and the guy said, Reverend Lucas, we got bad news for you. Said it did not work with you. There's so much osteoporosis has set in and so forth, you won't be able to stand. He said, what do you feel like? I said, well, I feel like jumping out the window. He said, well, because you can't stand, we don't have to worry about that, so hey, I'll do something else. So that's kind of a quick story of what's going on. But the last part of it is, I think all of you might be interested in this, that when something like this happens, you immediately, every day, you've got to take Oxycontin and Percocets and all of that, because the pain is very intense. And so when this first happened, I was every 4 hours and all of that. So I came, I said, look, I got to stop. I said, why? I said, because you're turning me into a junkie, and I know that's what's going to happen to me. I said, I know you're going to come in one day and say, no more medication. And Dr. Dunn, you know, when you're out here like I am, you know enough doctors and pharmacists that you're going to go to the back door and go and take this. So I said, I'll just stop and take the pain. And I was sitting in my living room. That's why I talk about my beliefs. And the doors were closed just like this. And all of a sudden, there was like a wind came in and took all the pain. And I have no pain. So now when I go, every time I go, they said, you don't have any Oxycontin, you don't have any Percocets. So how do you handle your pain? I said, I'm not in pain. I haven't been in pain for like 6 years. So it's a real blessing. So I just keep on going. And the last part of it is, even though I retired from the active ministry 3 years ago, when this first happened, they said, well, Reverend, you're still going to preach? Of course, I had to give him the old answer. I said, 40 years ago, when God called me to preach, he didn't tell me I had to stand up to do it. So I keep on going. You all know, you know St. James Church at 84th and Cedar. They have a new minister there in December. And unfortunately, he took ill. So I've been interim there for the last 2 months. So I'm still preaching and still going at it. Now, that gives you a little background of what's going on with me right now. then all those questions, you might have a different little piece to it since you know where I'm coming from. The last part of it is James Hardeman and I is not on the sheet. It's just a dear friend because we were in this together. We were both young, and I had hair, and he didn't have gray hair. And he had an afro. You got to see the pictures of us in those days. We looked nothing like this. I wasn't as thin as this man over here, but I weighed about 180 pounds, long way off. So that's my little prologue, prelude. You know how preachers are, we got to do something first.
Okay, ready to start?
Yes.
Tell me when.
Oh, did we turn off the heat?
Regina, why don't you strike there? Why don't you check? We don't want the thermostat to kick in and create noise.
The sun's already going like this, you better make it two. Make it two.
Tell me when.
Yeah.
Reverend Lucas, would you please state your full name and spell your last name for us?
Charles Payne Lucas, Jr., Lucas.
Do you have any aliases or nicknames that you tend to use?
No.
What's your date of birth?
February 26, 1941.
That means you have a birthday approaching very soon.
Yeah, I do.
You have to have me answer the question. Put the question in the first part. So Reverend Lucas, when you answer a question, can you say my birthday is, my name is, when he asks you, well, what color is the ceiling? The ceiling is white.
I got you, okay.
Want me to start over?
Yes, please.
Now you got me thinking.
And slow down. He's not gonna interrogate you.
Okay.
I'm all right.
Okay.
Reverend Lucas, what is your name?
My name is Charles Payne Lucas, Jr.
And would you spell your last name?
It is spelled Lucas.
Do you have any aliases or nicknames that you sometimes use?
I have no aliases or nicknames.
What is your date of birth?
My date of birth is February the 26th, 1941.
And you have a birthday approaching very soon, is that correct?
I do.
Where were you born?
I was born in Wheeling, West Virginia.
Where were your parents born?
My parents, my mother was born in Sedalia, Missouri, and my father was born in Cadiz, Ohio. We lived in Cadiz, Ohio because my father was the principal of the school there, a school that originally was founded by his great-grandfather for so-called colored children. Interestingly enough, even though he was principal of the school in Cadiz, Ohio, blacks were not permitted to go to the hospital. And the reason I was born in Wheeling, West Virginia is my mother didn't want a midwife, and so they drove the 30 miles from Cadiz to Wheeling so that I could be born in a hospital. So I came out of a segregated situation.
Very interesting. Now tell me, how did your parents end up in Cleveland?
In 1946, my father was offered a position to be the first black vice principal or assistant principal of a junior high school. And he came up on the bus to have the interview at the old Board of Education downtown. And when he got off the bus, he almost shows the air of times, he asked the first black person where was the Board of Education. And that person that he asked was Dr. Nathaniel Christopher, who at the time was president of the NAACP. And they started to talk, and Dr. Christopher asked my dad why he was coming and so forth. And he told him, and in conversation, he said, you know, we have a job opening as well as head of the NAACP. How much are they paying you to go to this job? And this sounds amazing now. He said $5,000 plus, and he offered him $7,000. And he said, you got a man, I'm ready. He came to Cleveland and became the first paid executive director of the NAACP.
Wow, that's really an interesting story. How old were you when they migrated to Cleveland?
I was 5.
Okay, and I assume that as a result of that, you did attend Cleveland schools?
Yeah, so we initially lived on the Gooding Avenue in the Glenville area. And I went to kindergarten and the first grade at Columbia Elementary School. We then moved to East Boulevard, and I went to Doane School, elementary school, Patrick Henry, Glenville.
What was the racial composition of the neighborhood, first of all?
Well, when I went to Columbia, it was about 90% white, 10%. When I went to Doane, I remember there was never more than 4 or 5 blacks in the class. In fact, when I went to Doane, many of the old mansions that used to be on East Boulevard and around in the University Circle area was still up and running, and a lot of families lived there. And when school was out, there was always maybe 10 or 12 limousines out in front of Doane School for little white kids whose parents were very wealthy, would jump in the limousines going to and from school. And I begged my father one day if he would drive up and let me get in the back seat and ride home. Of course, you know, he didn't agree to that. But that was the composition in Doane when I went there. When I went to Patrick Henry, it was about 80% 20. But the interesting thing was when I went to Patrick Henry from 1953, 1956. When I went to Glenville in 1956, it was about 60% white and 40% black, or a little bit more. But when I graduated in 1959, there were no whites in my class. That was a major migration when the white community moved out from Glenville. Of course, most of them moved into Cleveland Heights and other places. But each year, when the school year was up, you'd have your white classmates and you'd say, "I'll see you in September." And they would say, "No, you won't," because they knew they were moving that year.
So you were around when the Glenville neighborhood underwent its racial transformation.
It's major change, major change. When we moved on, we were the second blacks. We lived in the block between Superior and Ashbury. We were the second blacks on that whole block. And so I watched all of it happen from a white community to a middle class. Of course, at that time, we didn't consider that middle class, but it was like upper class because just about all of the blacks who were in any kind of professionalism lived either in Glenville or Mount Pleasant. Some were, of course, the older blacks like Claiborne George and that crowd, they were in the Cedar area in the 80s, 85, 86s, the 86 area. But everybody was in that area. I was telling somebody this wasn't exactly to the penny, I mean not to the penny, to the number, but I used to know everyone that had a Cadillac or a Lincoln in the whole area. They just knew that. You knew who had this and who had that. That was how tight that community was during those years as blacks came in and moved into the larger homes where the whites lived. Now, when I was growing up, the block between Ashbury and Wade Park, those were all big mansions. Now it's a long apartment complex that goes that whole building. And of course, now the Veterans Hospital has taken that over. And I think it's a beautiful thing they did to revitalize that area.
Well, when you saw the Glenville neighborhood and eventually the Glenville schools transform from overwhelmingly white to overwhelmingly black, were you aware of anything that was going on in the neighborhood to inspire that change, block busting?
There was the real estate people did some block busting. There's no doubt about it. When this first happened, because I remember it so very well, if a black would move on a block, they would call the other neighbor and say, blacks are moving in, and here's my card, and you might sell now where you can get a good price for your house and so forth. So that did go on. On the other end of it, the Glenville neighborhood during that time was a fairly safe neighborhood. You could, I remember it was not unusual for my parents to say, let's go to dinner at Deering's or some of the other restaurants in the area. 105th was full of black-owned establishments, and we knew everybody that owned all of them down the line. And so it was a good place to grow up. And the blacks that moved into the area made it a pretty sound place.
Did a significant number of professionals move into the Glenville area?
That's who moved in. That's who moved in. As I said, you could, as far as the organizations that you belong to and the clubs and so forth, because at that time, clubs were, because desegregation laws, people, I often talk to people now, even in these areas, they think that desegregation laws were in the 1900s, way back. It was 1963, 64, 65. And so during those years, you had a lot of groups. I know a good friend of ours owned a Carlton House, and that was a place where many black events took place. And others I could name that owned places where blacks could congregate. So the black social clubs were, they're still, many of them are popular today, like I remember Jack and Jill, Tots and Teens were formed, and Links, Girlfriends, and Cosmopolitans, and all those clubs. I know on Saturdays, many black women, they played bridge, they had a lot. So you had a lot of interaction of people that made the community a strong community, and you knew everybody, and at least I did. And with my father in NAACP, my mother taught school, and so forth. So we were out in it, and I feel very fortunate to have grown up in the Glenville area at that time.
You indicated that your father came here initially to be a principal, but ended up working for the NAACP. What about your mother?
My mother, as I mentioned, she was a teacher. She taught 4th grade for 42 years. She was originally at Dyke School, and she ended up at Doane, the school where I attended. She graduated from Lincoln, and she was a member of Delta and Girlfriends and this, that, and the other. You remember her, she was quite a feisty lady. She lived to be 95 years old.
Hopefully we'll make it.
Well, the way you're talking, I don't know if I had that long, but.
Tell me this, you mentioned Carlton House, you mentioned Deering's. What are those establishments for people that weren't around during that era?
Deering's, there were a number of blacks who had restaurants. The one on Cedar, fish place, leaves me right now. But there were a number of us that, you just knew everybody that had restaurants and so forth. And the restaurants were excellent. You could go, you have your dinner, you didn't have the static places now have to worry about the protection and crime and all that. And it wasn't that way. Yes, there was, naturally there's always been crime in a major city, but it was just a safer place at that time. Carl Kent, who was a physician, and his wife, Louise, who was a school teacher, they realized that, blacks needed a place to have events and parties and so forth. So they opened up they had several locations. One was on 105th Street, one was on Euclid and so forth. It was called the Carlton House, and where you could rent it and have weddings and social events and so forth. So many events were there. And there were 4 or 5 other people that did the same thing. Because you talk about Cleveland, Ohio, I remember when 2 organizations were the first to have an event at a downtown hotel. The hotels wouldn't rent to blacks. They had always some excuse that the calendar was booked or some reason or another they would cancel them. I might not be exactly correct about this because I know the Lodge, I think they did something at one hotel. But I remember when the Girlfriends went down to, at that time, the Pitt Carter Hotel on Prospect. Now it's a apartment complex. But at one time, it was a pretty classy hotel. And the quick story is that they went down to rent the room for their annual event. And the manager of the hotel at that time told them, oh, I'm so sorry, the date I thought was available, it's not. Well, one of the ladies happened to look on saw his calendar, and she said, well, I don't see anything on this date. And so he said, okay. He said, but the only thing is you have to have a deposit. And so they said, well, we'll give you a deposit, but it has to be in cash. I mean, he went from one thing to the other. So, you know, with all due respect to these ladies here, they asked him to step out for a minute. And they went in their secret places, and they came up with, they said, rather than here's the deposit, here's the whole thing. And so they were the first to have an event at the Pitt Carter Hotel. That's Cleveland, Ohio. And along with that is often they have these pictures of Cleveland, Ohio with a busy shopping, and we want to bring Cleveland back to those days. Well, I remember because I was just 10 years old when my father had a protest about black women could not try on clothes at May Company and all of the major stores. Men couldn't try on suits. There was a big, at one point on the corner of 9th and Euclid, it was a very fancy men's store called Bonds. It was right on the corner. It was a very unique building. But you could buy a suit, but you couldn't try on a suit there. And so we had a protest to welcome them, and I had a little picket sign. And my sign said, Jim Crow must go. I had no idea who Jim Crow was, but I knew he had to go. And we picketed up and down Euclid Avenue. The other thing during those years, and this is, of course, in the pre-60s, they had old charger plates for May Company and Higbee's and Halley's, Sterling Linder Davis, so forth. And each store had a notch. That's how you could charge things there. And blacks could not get their notch on their charger plate. And NAACP protested, and we had a big thing. And finally, blacks were able to get a notch. So when you look at that picture of old Cleveland, also look and see that that was old Cleveland for white people, but not old Cleveland for black people. That was a little more than you asked me for.
No, that's great. You came along when Euclid Beach was still a recreational facility. Did you ever have occasion to go out to Euclid?
You could go, but you couldn't skate, and you couldn't go to they had a big place where they had dancing. You could go on the rides, but you couldn't skate, and you could not have rent a place for dancing. Or they had dances regularly every Friday and Saturday night, but you could not go to the dancing. And so the NAACP again had a major protest, and they boycotted the Euclid Beach. And Euclid Beach Association, the Humphrey family, owned that. We went to court about it and so forth about the protest, but black people cooperated, and some white people as well, and did not use the facilities. And of course, everybody hated that because everybody loved Euclid Beach because of the rides and so forth. But they opened up the skating, and they opened up the dance hall for blacks. I was a part of that young person.
Now, your mother was a teacher, and your father worked for the NAACP. How did they feel about education, as far as you can recall?
Well, there was several things. My father, interestingly enough, he graduated from Wilberforce in 30, right in the midst of the Depression. And he, at that time, they had what was known as a colored teacher's manual that came out to all of the, they called them Negro colleges, colored colleges at that time. And you would just send a letter. My father said at that time, you didn't call because that meant that you were not thrifty, but you would write all these schools and ask them. So he got a job in Sedalia, Missouri. That's how he got to Missouri. And so when he was in Missouri, he met my mother, and they had segregated schools there. And the superintendent of the school, he had a daughter that was also of marriage, age. And so the superintendent said to my father, here's your contract for next year, but also my daughter. Well, he was going with my mother at the time. So he couldn't get the contract because he wasn't going to marry the superintendent's daughter. So there he was out in Missouri with nothing to do. And someone came through and said, young man, we need to do something about the University of Kansas to break them. Said, I'll sponsor you going to get a master's in education there if you're willing to go up against these white folks and so forth. And my father, that's how he got to University of Kansas. And it was just unusual in 1931 for a black man to have a master's in education. And his pride is his graduation picture from the University of Kansas in 1931. And the only thing they had was his neck down, his chest down. They took his picture out because he's brown. And he said, isn't that silly, not to take the whole thing, but here's this picture of the graduation class, but only not his head, so they couldn't see. So that's how he was really firm in education. That was his background. So he came to Cleveland and he found out what was going on with the school system. And it's probably a later thing to talk about, but he immediately got involved with the FEPC, and he was one of the first to get the state to do some educational pieces. And then later, when they set up the state school board, he was the first black elected to that school board. So he stayed in, even though he was in the NAACP initially, and of course after that he went in business for himself, then he went on to many other things after that. But he was always interested in education.
Sounds like a very interesting person. What type of things did he go into other than working for the NAACP?
Well, when he left there, he became an investor in Creighton Sausage, which at that time was a leading food processor for sausage for Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and he served there. And then he branched out into a real estate firm, and then he was appointed the head of HUD for Ohio and Michigan, and he did that. But at all times, he stayed active in the NAACP and any other civil rights things that were going on. It's kind of in my blood because of that.
Can't escape it. Tell me this. If you would, describe, after your high school years, your educational background.
I went on to the University of Pittsburgh, and I went there for an odd reason at the time. They had introduced a trimester program where you could graduate in 2.5 years. And for some reason, at 18 years old, I felt that was important, and I don't know why I was in such a hurry at that time. But that's where I started. And I was sitting in St. James Church, which is my home church, and I was blessed with a calling to go in the ministry. And I went on to Boston University. At that time, they still had the School of Religion, and I was there. And from there, I started in my ministerial career at St. Paul Church on the west side, and I was there for 3 years, and 9 years rather, and then I was assigned, I'm in the African Methodist Episcopal Church where we were assigned by bishops, and then I was assigned to Greater Avery AME Church, 7505 Wade Park. I served there for 3 years, then I was assigned to First Church, Kansas City, which is our largest AME church in the Midwest. I served there for 9 years. And then my parents became ill in 1989, and I asked the bishop to reassign me to Cleveland, but to give me a smaller charge so I could look after them. My wife was ill at that time, too. So I came back here, and I served Christ our Redeemer in Cleveland Heights for 17 years.
You got into your employment, I was still on your education.
Oh.
But you went to, as I understand it.
And then the last thing, when I was in Kansas City, the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri collaborated in a program, and they set up a separate institution called the Central Central Institute for Ministerial Development, and it ended up having a formal name and a approved name, and I got my doctorate in religion at that time, specializing in the Old Testament.
I see. What year would that have been?
That was in 1964.
Okay. Were you in Cleveland during the middle 60s when all of the protests were going on about the Cleveland schools and construction of
Yeah, I came back in 66. I got married in 66, and I was here from then on.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to know what institutions, movements, events, individuals helped shape your view on civic issues?
Well, because I grew up in an atmosphere, my father was also very much involved in politics. And so it was not unusual for our dinner table to have all of the politicians of the day, Charlie Carr, Gus Parker, Claiborne George, and so forth. So I knew them all. So they all became my role models, really. I had the privilege of meeting Thurgood Marshall. He was a dear friend of my father's. So he would come to Cleveland, and he was near at the house. Daisy Lampkin and Walter White, Roy Wilkins, you name it. Because of my father's involvement with NAACP, they were all in and out of my life. And so they helped shape not only my desires to do as much as I could to help our people, but also to try to have some kind of standard of living. And I was just enamored. My father would tell me, if you don't talk, you can stay in the room. And so I would get over in a corner somewhere and listen to all the conversations back and forth. And he would tell me, he said, now, anything you want to know, you ask me after they leave. Because if you start talking, you'll have to go. So they would put it all out on the table, and I would get to hear everything. My father did something else that I carried on with my kids, and it might sound kind of silly, but my father used to come in the middle of the night, wake me up and ask me a question. And he'd ask me, who's the Vice President of the United States? Who's the Senator from Ohio? I'd just wake up and have to always have an answer. And it was just something that was kind of funny, but my kids used to fuss at me and say, well, I wish Grandfather hadn't taught you that, of all the things we did. But he was, the other thing we did, and this was, we had a dinner every night. My father always had dinner every night, basically, every night. And when dinner was over, he would pull back his chair and we would discuss some topic of the day. That went on every day. And of course, the other thing was, did you read the newspaper? And he always pointed out, remember, the newspaper is somebody's point of view. Don't ever believe everything that you read in the newspaper. That's their point of view. And then we would do that every day, and I did that with my kids as well.
Pretty interesting. Now, what you described probably was taking place during the height of the civil rights movement.
That's right.
What was your understanding of the civil rights movement, even though you were a child at the time?
Well, I was a child, but then I was right in the midst of it. Don't forget, when I got to Boston University, that was right in the middle of the sit-ins and the bus rides and all of that, which I participated in all of it. And Boston was a real hub of civil rights activities because of the number of influential whites that financed the buses to do the rides and anything that you were protesting and so forth. I think one of my most amusing protests was against Shawmut Bank in Boston. They had no hiring practice for blacks. And we went down, we were picketing, and the bank president, I don't think he was this high, he came out and he said, just a minute, everybody, just stop. So and I was the first one in line. He said, do you want a job? And I said, no, I'm in school. He said, get away from my bank. He said, do you want a job? I said, yeah, come on in here. Do you want a job? So he went off through the line. He said, don't picket my bank unless you want a job. But we would picket the banks, I was sit-ins. And, so I was steeped in it all the way through school. And when I came back to Cleveland, which was just an interesting part of events, my father, who had served on the board for years, when I came back, he said, Junior, he said, you got to get involved. And so, NAACP board here. At that time, Jim, if you remember, well, this last time was kind of exciting too, but during those years, to get on the NAACP board was a major piece. They used to have the elections down at the Phyllis Wheatley. People lined up all around to vote. And so they put me on. And that's how I got back onto the board. Of course, right at that same time, we were right in the midst of the Glenville riots. I was right there for that, the Huff riots. I was in one of the cars. I volunteered to ride up and down Huff and try to calm people down and all of that. I was one of that cars, one of the Jeeps, Army Jeeps. So I've been in all of my life.
Well, obviously you were alive. Just for a second. Yeah. I was going to suggest that, but I didn't want to stop you. The phone was ringing.
Yeah.
Making all that noise.
If I'm being too lengthy, you just do like that.
Listen. The simple thing may be for me to go answer it. They'll stop calling.
Turn the ringer down though?
Let me see.
Is this what you're getting? You're getting what you want, or? Okay.
Reverend Lucas, my daughter went to Delma Elementary. My sister went to Delma Elementary. Maybe she had you on. She went there, we lived on Westchester.
Okay, okay.
On Westchester. We moved to Mount Pleasant in 1953. And so my sister went through maybe first grade. She went to kindergarten and first grade.
Yeah, mother taught fourth grade.
Oh.
Yeah, all those years, fourth grade.
Isn't that something?
And in 70, one of them, it was October, she went in and said, this is it. I said, what do you mean? Said, when I started teaching, I was 18, and I knew when the last day would be, and this is it. I said, well, it's not the end of the term. It's not. She said, no, this is it. Thank you. I know that I knew when it was going to be the last day. And so she came up.
Reverend Lucas, you indicated that you were up close and personal when the civil rights movement was going on. Do you have any recollections of the Brown versus Board of Education decision?
Oh, very much so. And then I had another piece to it when I was a pastor of First Church, Kansas City. Topeka, Kansas is not that far from there, and I got to know some of the people that were involved in on a one-on-one basis. So I had a later, naturally that was after the decision, but when the decision was going on, we were very supportive of it, and we were waiting to hear the answer. And I think those of us, you talk about celebrations, that was a major celebration when the Supreme Court came back with that decision, because it wasn't expected.
That was 1954, so
Yeah.
you would have been
Yeah, I was,
13?
yeah, in there somewhere. Yeah, but because of my dad, and that was the talk of the day, and they were over there talking about it every day. My father belonged to 2 organizations, and my mother always claimed they were really cover-up organizations. They would talk politics for about 3 hours and play poker. And she said they really just wanted to play poker, but they would come over on Friday nights, and that's when I'd hear all these spirited conversations, because people like Ralph Finley and Gus Parker, who was a judge, and Charlie Carr and John Kellogg and all of them, they were all in the room there talking politics and talking about what was going on. And of course, during those years, one of the biggest things that we were faced with, even a little bit later, was you had a group of blacks in Cleveland that were saying, we need to push on. Then you had another group that was saying, well, let's not rock the boat. We're getting to this. We're coming along. And of course, you had another group that was completely saying, this is all unnecessary. We're satisfied with what we have. And that was always a part of the conversation. Should we really go do this and we could do that? I remember when, Charlie Vanek had been the congressman, and a good congressman as far as I was concerned, for the area. But they realized that something had to be done, and that's when my father and Lou Stokes and Carl Character filed the suit to set up the 21st Congressional District. You remember they went to court, and they won that case, and that created the district that Lou Stokes served all those years. That all started in my father's living room.
Well, you mentioned a number of very significant people. What was your mother's name?
Hazel Lucas. She was a Jones, Hazel Jones Lucas. She had there were 4 sisters, all of them school teachers. One of them came to Cleveland with my mother, Jewel Jordan. She taught as well, and her husband was in education. He was the first director of major work for the Cleveland system, Dr. Charles Jordan, some years ago.
Well, you've talked a little bit about where you were when Brown versus Board came down in 1954. Where were you when Emmett Till died?
Well, I was here in Cleveland, and that was such a major event.
I'm sorry. Can you start off with when Emmett Till died?
When Emmett Till died, I was here in Cleveland, and of course that was a major event across the country, and of course a double major event for black people, because his mother, as you remember, insisted that there be an open casket, and that his picture was on Jet and Ebony and every black newspaper across the country. And just to see that mutilated picture of that young boy in a casket, supposedly because he made an advance to a white lady, that really sparked the conscience of America, both black and white. It was just horrible. And unfortunately, the loss of a life, and this has not been unusual in our history, but the loss of a life caused much new thinking about race relations in America. And so I remember it very well.
Do you recall anything about where you were when Martin Luther King died?
Oh, very much so. My wife and I, when we heard the news, I was here. The shock of it, because I had the opportunity to participate in several of the marches. I had met him on a number of occasions, and of course, being a pastor, preacher myself, just listening to him was always music to your spiritual ears. And the thing that jarred me was, once again, we've been going through this assassination business, once again that a force in America felt that the way to quell or to quench or to stop so-called civil rights would be to kill the person that they thought was in charge of it. Of course, the killing of Martin Luther King even gave new direction and a spirit to the movement in many places. But that was a very, very sad day for us and for America, and for the world, really.
Do you recall when Carl Stokes was elected mayor of the city of Cleveland?
Yes, I was somewhat active in that campaign. When I say somewhat, I just gotten back on the scene. I was establishing. Yeah.
Can you say
when Carl Stokes was elected, I had just.
I'm sorry. Let me make sure my voice is out.
When Carl Stokes was elected, I participated in the campaign. We lived on Cormier, right behind Shaker Square, and then the next street, and the next street was Larchmere. So we were neighbors. My wife and Shirley Stokes were very good friends, and our children, the two younger children, Carl Jr. was a little older, but our children were very close, so we were family friends. Of course, my father was close with Carl as well, so I knew him quite well, and was very excited about his election.
All these events you've described, can you give us a capsule idea of how it affected you and your thought process and your involvement in the movement?
Well, the election of Carl Stokes was so significant. First of all, we also knew Seth Taft, and but I was pastoring on the west side, and the church I pastored was on the corner of West 130th and Liberty, and the church sat on this side, and on this side of 130th, no blacks lived at all. And on the other side of the street, Guardian, Brookside, there's a number of streets where blacks lived. And it was just amazing to me how segregated that west side was. And when Carl was running, I had him come out to our church to speak. And it was such a sight because not only the church was just packed, but we opened up the windows of the church and there were maybe 300 or 400 people outside of the church, just surrounding the building, black people living on the west side. And of course, the next day, our windows of the church were broken and all that kind of stuff. I knew that was going to happen. But the segregation of Cleveland has always been so troublesome to me, the east side and the west side. We are two cities, and then we're of course, today's Cleveland is much different than Cleveland at that time, but there's still major segregation pockets in the city of Cleveland.
You made reference to Seth Taft. Who was Seth Taft?
Who ran against Carl Stokes?
The incidents you've described, including, well, let me ask the question a different way. You've touched upon it a little bit, but where were you when the Huff and Glenville riots occurred?
Well, I was here in Cleveland, and as I mentioned, we lived, my wife and my wife Vicky, I'm mentioning her name, and my son Jason and my daughter Laurel. We lived on Cormier, as I mentioned, right behind Shaker Square. My parents still lived on East Boulevard, and so my parents called me because when you stood on our front porch, you could see the flames coming up from burning in the Huff area. So naturally, we jumped in the car and I went over to be with my parents in the Huff area. At the same time, I was being called by John Jacobs and a number of the ministers who had formed a kind of an ad hoc group immediately to respond to what was going on in the Huff area. And so I went over, and then I got the call to that they were going to, I think we met at Olivet, but I'm not sure. I know Reverend Hoover and I were together, but we met at a church, and I've forgotten which one. And we all then, those who came, agreed to ride up and down the blocks and tell people to come and go home and so forth. And so I was in the middle of it.
Were you involved with the NAACP at that time?
Yes, I was serving.
Did you serve as an officer with the NAACP?
By a very unusual way.
Okay, can we stop right here?
Yeah.
So can you say, Mr. Lucas, can you say, I was involved with the NAACP at that time, I was an officer, and I served, and go on from there?
All right. I was involved in the NAACP at that time as an officer, but in a very unusual way. I attained that goal. During those years, the NAACP had a system where they had a president and then a first vice president who could serve if need be, and then a second vice president who was a woman, and a third vice president who was youth. That was the idea of it. I was the third vice president as the youth. The president was Russell Adrian, a very fine attorney in Cleveland. And he was offered the position as the legal counsel. At that time was the CTS board, which is now RTA. And that was quite a big position. But they told him that he couldn't be the counsel and stay president of NAACP. The first vice president was a white Catholic priest. And when the news came that he was going to be the president of the NAACP, to show you the Catholic hierarchy in this town, his bishop moved him to New Orleans that night. And he had to pack up his bag and leave Cleveland that night. So he was gone. The second vice president was a lady named Ethelyn Gorman, who was an employee of the Cleveland Public Library. And they told her if she still wanted to work with the library, she couldn't be president of NAACP, which left me. And there I was, 25 years old, 6'1", and I'm now the president of the NAACP at a very rough time in our history. Now, I must say for the record that at that time, we were talking about our afros, and I was probably closer to Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael than I was to Roy Wilkins in my mind. So I became the president of the NAACP, but I calmed down enough to, because that time, NAACP board was the who's who of Cleveland. They were on the NAACP board. You name them and they were on the board. During those years, if you wanted to go anywhere in Cleveland, you became a member of the NAACP board. So I became the president. I ran the next time for my own term, and when it was over with, I was so happy that I was re-elected. One of the members came up to me and said, "Don't get the big head, because most people, when they say saw Charles Lucas, they thought they were voting for your father." So I served that term. And of course, that was the big term that we filed the desegregation suit.
Now, you were president of the Cleveland branch when the suit was filed.
I was.
Explain, if you can, when you first became aware of problems related to segregation in the Cleveland public schools.
Interestingly enough, when the NAACP at that time, and still, has various committees. And when I became president, because of to me, the total segregated educational system in Cleveland with the east side and the west side, at that time you had the east side was getting used books from the west side. Anything cream of the crop went to the west side, not to the east side. Your better teachers were sent to the west side, not to the east side. And I was so proud of the Cleveland education that I'd received to see it deteriorating to the point. We even had buildings, and those, some people don't believe this, but we had buildings where white teachers would not serve on the same floor with black teachers. So you had like an elementary school where naturally it used to be the kindergarten, the first, so on the first floor, and second and the fifth, the fourth, and sixth up on the top floors. You had maybe a kindergarten up on the top floor because it had a black teacher, and everything was going on in the school system. So I had a group of friends who were, some were teachers, some were professors, some were just interested in education. And I got them involved in the education committee of the NAACP. Roland Johnson was one of the top people on that committee, and some of the rest of them. And we put together what we call the Cleveland Plan. And interestingly enough, if you would take that plan that we were proposing to the Board of Education, and you were talking about magnet school, you were talking about specialty schools, all that was in the plan. This was before the aviation school was built. This is before what they've done now to John Hay and so forth. Some days when I see what's gone on in recent years, when they've come out, what were they going to do with the system and so forth, we presented that in the 70s to try to do something to make education better for all children, especially black children. During those years, they were building schools almost next to each other to keep the containment. They're just building. So the education atmosphere was still white and black, east and west, and we wanted to do something about it. I was in school in Boston when busing. There was a lady named Louise Day Hicks. A little side story about this. Louise Day Hicks, who was the president of the Board of Education up in Boston, she closed up the schools rather than have them integrated. And I was a student there at the time. And the white students all had places to go. Black students were just walking the streets, had nothing to do with it. So a group of professional people, when I say professional, educated and so forth, because Boston had so many professors and so forth, they put a plea out for freedom schools to operate. And so I was assigned to a freedom school as a principal of one of the freedom schools. But I'm telling you my background is about desegregation, how I hated busing. And I saw what was going on. But the little side event was when they gave me my list of my teachers, one of the teachers on there was a teacher named Vicky Fortune. And I said, I want to see who that is. And so she came in, beautiful, beautiful young black lady. I said, are you Vicky Fortune? I said, I've always wanted to make a fortune. And she said, is that the best you could come up with? And of course, that became my wife of 40-some years. But that particular day, coincidentally, was my birthday. So I said, today's my birthday. I said, would you like to go to dinner with me on my birthday? She said, you must be very unpopular if you haven't been able to get your birthday together before now. So I knew that too. This was the lady I wanted. But anyway, when I was in the midst of all that went on, if you remember Boston, they had the riots, and it was a horrible situation. So the last thing I wanted was busing in Cleveland. The last thing you want, last thing any of us wanted was busing in Cleveland. I'm president of NAACP. We had a young director at that time, Reverend James Stallings, was also the assistant pastor of Antioch Baptist Church, very articulate young guy. So he had kind of some young Turks all in there. So we went to the Board of Education. People have never heard this part. We went to Paul Briggs, James Tanner, Canella Coulter Brown, and all that crowd was involved in that. And we went to Paul Briggs with our plan. And we presented it. We had meetings after meetings. Said, this is what you can do to avert busing. That's the whole thing was. You don't need busing. Because you can take these buildings and turn them into this. You can have these buildings. I said, but you can't have a good educational system like it is now. You're graduating this percentage on the west side, but you're not graduating this percentage on the east side. We had it all. I mean, it wasn't, the meetings were not combative. They were not a big fuss. We were laying it out in a very professional way. So he said, I'll present it to the board. I'll present it to the board. This kept going on. When are you going to present it to the board? When are you going to present it to the board? When are you going to present it to the board? This went on and on. Well, in the meantime, the NAACP board itself was not all on board talking about what to do with the educational system, especially desegregation. And so you had your old-liners in there. People have been on the board for years and years. They, of course, did not want to rock the boat. Then you had the newer group that I was representing and so forth. They said something has to be done about education. And we were very passionate about it. So meeting after meeting, and Jim, if you remember, they had 2 impeachment votes against me. They were going to get rid of me. let's get this young crazy man, he's crazy. One guy said, you're obtuse. Got up and said, you're obtuse. What's obtuse mean? I'm obtuse because I want good education system for people in the city. Went on and on. And if you recall, during those years, board meetings would go up to 10, 11 o'clock at night there and go on and on. Everybody would get up and speak for a long, long time. So anyway, both of them, I won the impeachment thing. And so we got down to it, and this was one of the most interesting things that I'll never forget as long as I live. Some of the old guard felt that Roy Wilkins, who at that time was head of the NAACP, because they had so much going on in the other cities, and there was chaos here and problems here and so forth, and the cost of doing something like this was almost prohibitive. They said, well, we want you to go up to New York and ask Roy Wilkins his opinion on what we should do. And so Jim Hardiman and Charles Lucas and Jim Stallings, we went up to New York. And my chronology might be off by a few minutes or so, but we were having an appointment with Roy Wilkins at 11 o'clock. And so we went up to New York, and we were waiting, and when you, in NAACP circles at that time, when you're talking about going to see Roy Wilkins, you're going next to Jesus. I mean, this is big time, going to see Roy Wilkins, the icon of civil rights and so forth. So we sat there and sat there and sat there. So finally, he said, come in. So we came in, and after the initial pleasantries, he looked at his watch and he said, oh my goodness, it's 12 o'clock. He said, at 12 o'clock, I always have a standing luncheon for Chinese, and so and so and so. Come on, we go to eat dinner. So we jump in a cab, because New York, everybody in a cab. We went to this Chinese restaurant, and we sat there, and we were all just bubbling to talk, And so, since I was the president, now, he said, oh, no, he said, one thing, I have a standing agreement. I never talk civil rights or business over lunch. And so we had lunch, and we were having lunch. And so then lunch is over, and he said, oh my goodness, he said, the governor is expecting me. And he put out his hand, he shook hands with all of us. He said, good luck, and walked out the door. We never had a conversation about it. And of course, to show as smart as we were, it didn't dawn on us until we were on the plane. We've been had. he didn't want to discuss this thing with us. But at the time, we were just in the whole piece of it. We got on the plane, so we came back. And the board was waiting on us that night. It was because this was the night we were going to vote if we're going to file the desegregation case or not. So they went one procedural vote after another to put it off. And so finally they said, would you go to Paul Briggs one more time and see if the board would at least look at it? We just want him to talk about it. We wanted to put it out on the table. So we get a call, and I remember his name now. We get a call that Frank Joseph, who was at that time leading attorney at Jones Day, extremely wealthy man, blah, 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 symphony and all that. He also, during these years, and you probably learned, every Board of Education, there's always another group over here that kind of runs things. And he was in that group at that time of wealthy Clevelanders, industrialists, builders, the union people. Those were the voices that ran this sort of thing. So he called us and he said, we want to meet you at the Union Club for breakfast. And I said, I can't go to the Union Club. Because at that time, that was before blacks had gone to, I said, I can't go to the Union Club. And they persuaded us, oh, Charles, this is so important, we just go in there and go for breakfast. So Jim Stallings and we trooped into the Union Club. And so once again, we put the spiel on the table of the plan and what it would do. you bring it up to the Board of Education and so forth. Well, the whole time I was talking, this lawyer that I mentioned to you and the others, they never would look at me. I'm talking and they're looking off to the side. And not only did I find that unsettling, but fairly rude. I'm talking to you this way, you're looking the other way. So after we all made a passionate plea of what this would do for Cleveland, and we threw it in there that we don't want busing, we don't da-da-da-da-da. Frank Joseph slowly turned his head around. He looked at me, young man. Of course, when you're the age we were, the worst thing an older person can do is say to you, young man, because you know immediately that they're patting you down. Any more than in my business in the church when they come in and say, Reverend, I love you. When they start like that, something getting ready to come after that. I said, young man, you don't have the balls to file a suit against the Cleveland Board of Education. Turned his head back. Well, that almost solved it right there, but it didn't. We waited that night. Paul Briggs was to present it to the Board of Education. And of course, we all piled over there. That's when the meetings were all still at the board. And the meeting went on and on and on. Paul talked about this, he talked about that, talked about this. And finally they said, end of the superintendent's report. He said, is there anything else to come before us tonight? I said, no, the meeting is adjourned. So that solved it. So we went back to the board to have our meeting to make the final decision. And needless to say, you couldn't get near at that time, St. James Church was his 8401 seater. Next to the church used to be a funeral home called Angelus Funeral Home. And this Dr. Christopher that I mentioned earlier, he was a dentist and a funeral director. Wasn't that an interesting combination? So he handled your teeth, and then when you died, he buried you. And he owned the Angelus Funeral Home, and across the street was his dental office. Well, straight across the street, his daughter had a flower shop, Monroe's Floral Shop, and her name was Odessa Salve. She was on the board too. But anyway, we went in to have the board meeting. We got to the board meeting, and the arguments were fierce. And they accused us of everything in the world. And Jim Stallings, his job was in jeopardy. They were going to impeach me again. This Hardiman fella, he's just trying to learn law off of us. He's just trying to get a job. And he They rode the coals on us that night. And so we got ready to have the final vote. Are we going to file the desegregation suit or not? And we had the vote, and it was a tie. And when it was a tie, someone beckoned me, and they said, your father is on the line. Well, they had called my dad while all this was going on. And so he called me, and he was to tell me to vote not to let the desegregation case go. So I picked up the phone, and my father said, Junior, they tell me it's hot in there. I said, it's very hot. He said, God bless you, and hung up. So I said, he and Roy Wilkins were together. So I was into him. So I knew what that meant. The Lord lead you. So I went back in and, of course, broke the tie. And we were off to the races. Nate Jones, who later became, of course, a judge, but he became our lead counsel along with Hardiman. We didn't have any money. It takes money to do all this. And so we had applied for several grants and so forth. They weren't in yet. At that time, the black bank in town was Quincy Savings and Loan. And I went over to Quincy Savings and Loan and mortgaged my house. So we would have some operating capital to get going until the funds came in. My wife was very happy about that whole situation, and you know, I didn't mean that. What's going to happen if that money doesn't come in? We're going to have to live in the street. I said, well, the Lord will make a way. She said, well, I hope he does, because he'll have to make a way for you by yourself. But it all worked out. And that's how we got started with the desegregation case. Now that was a nutshell.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot more war stories to be told. What were the goals of this lawsuit that was filed in 1973?
The initial goals of the lawsuit, and this was the tremendous goal, was for the Board of Education to recognize what they really were. And when you talk about a goal, that was the goal. That you were educating white children and black children in a different way. That was a major goal. That was goal one. We wanted kids to have equal opportunities of education in up north Cleveland, Ohio. The goal was to have schools available to all students that were trying to give them the same educational benefits. In other words, if I went to school on the east side, if I went to school on the west side, I was getting the same plate. That was the basic goal. Naturally, when you get into the horrible thing of busing, a whole new thing develops. And it did. There's no doubt about it.
So, were you optimistic or pessimistic that we would be able to
Well,
realize those goals?
naturally, I was very optimistic. I was very hopeful. And some goals were attained. We had, the NAACP, of course, you know, had a major turmoil because many of the schools that had been built side by side and so forth, they had black principals. They had black principals and vice principals and so forth. And naturally, when these closed up, these teachers and principals, I mean, not teachers, these administrators had to go back in this classroom. So they weren't happy with us at all. As you know, NAACP is supported by contributions with the membership as well as contributions with the annual dinners and et cetera, et cetera. When those people that were supporting you, the life memberships and so forth, if you remember, we had a number of life members that called and gave us the business because we had taken away not only their positions and status. You had people who were very afraid of that Cleveland was going to be a Boston, that kids were going to be hurt, killed, that there was going to be riots again. Personally, as you know, what happened to my house was stormed with bricks and all of that, dead rabbits and dead squirrels at my door. When I opened up my door, I'd get up early before my kids would go to school in the morning to get all that stuff away from the front of my door. All that went on. And interestingly enough, I lived at 13601 Cormier, here's my house, and the police chief lived right across the street from me with a police car in front. But all that still went on at my house.
Well, looking back, was it worth the effort?
Very much so. Very much so. It was, looking back, it was very much worth the effort because things have changed. They have not changed. It took many years for a lot of the changes to take place. But the board has been restructured. Soon after that, the mayor took charge of the school system, the board personnel, and so forth. So I think we gave the spark to what had happened in later years.
You mentioned a number of African Americans that were in positions of authority with the Cleveland Board of Education. Were they pleased or generally displeased with the actions of the NAACP?
I think, because I knew all of them personally, I think all of them would have preferred that it have not occurred. Interestingly enough, Canella Brown is still living. She's 88, very vibrant and so forth. I talk with her frequently. She coincidentally was my 7th grade teacher, and we've had a relationship all the way through. I think at the time they would have preferred it not, of course. But I think privately, they realized they were running a segregating system. In fact, if you recall, there were a number of blacks that were elevated in the administrative level after this that weren't in before, because during that time you had Christine Branch and my uncle Charles Jordan and James Tanner and Canella Brown and Lethia Warren. So if I can name, I mean, I'm missing maybe 2 or 3, but if I can name all of the black administrators during that time, you can see what you're dealing with when you have 40 or 50 of them.
Let's go off the record just a second.
Okay. Carol? And we're speaking. Hold on just 1 second.
Reverend Lucas, do you know the number to ride to
Is that the wrong number?
I'm not getting it.
621-9500.
621-9500.
Yeah, and then press 134. That's dispatch. After you get it.
Ronnie? Ronnie? Yeah. Give me time. You just take it off. Speaking phone. We're gonna wait. Okay.
We really haven't, this, whatever you're going to come out with in the end, will probably be the closest thing that has ever been written about the era. You know, the sad thing about NAACP and civil rights organizations, we're still always on a shoestring. So your recorded history is not good. You know, you have other organizations, you know, at the end of the year they have an exhaustive volume of what went on and so forth. We don't have anything. And then the bookkeeping, another bookkeeping, the record keeping is so poor. Now you take, Jim, the NAACP recently moved a couple of weeks ago to a new place. And I would make you a bet that 50% of the stuff that was at the old place didn't get to the new place. I'd make you a bet. And I'm not saying this in a derogatory, putting them down, but in that move, because the people there don't know what they're looking at. And then the other thing happened, while we were still at Stokes, everything was in the basement and there was a flood. And stuff was just pitched out because it was ruined. So our the history of the NAACP is lacking in written form, or oral form, or recorded form. So that's something you ought to think about.
50 years down the road.
Because you've got Sarah,
Harper?
Judge Harper, and you, McMickle, George Forbes, and myself, and Clarence Holmes.
Is Clarence Holmes still alive?
Clarence Holmes still alive.
Got to track him down.
That's all's left of all the presidents. And, you know, that should be captured, each piece of that.
Is Harold Williams still alive?
Who?
Harold Williams, he
Oh, the fuel mobile. Did they work that out all right?
Yeah, they said they'd be here in an hour. It'll be about an hour.
Okay,
They said, so it should be at 4, by 4.
okay.
I'm gonna have to run. I have to go pick my car up before they close, before the shop closes. So, thank you, Reverend Lucas. This has been very informative, very educational for me, and I think it's been a great interview. So I look forward to seeing the final product when we're done. Okay.
Good to see you again.
Okay, good seeing you, Reverend.
Okay, Ronnie. See
All
you
right,
later.
see everyone. Have a good weekend.
Okay, let's go back on.
So we're gonna, you know, right where you're gonna start?
Yeah. Gary?
You good?
Reverend Lucas, you described some of the financial issues that were faced by the Cleveland branch as we tried to finance this litigation. Were you ever repaid, or were you ever able to repay that mortgage you took out on your house?
Yes, I did. Not totally, but I did, but that was all right. The atmosphere around the desegregation suit was quite interesting because you had you can imagine if the board was so divided in the filing the suit, you can imagine that was also felt out in the community. A number of the ministers were supportive, but there were also a number who were not supportive of filing the suit for various reasons. Some of them for reasons that they felt that the board should be given more time, although we had been working on this for several years. Others because members of their family, sometimes their wife, were principals or assistant principals of schools that were being closed because of desegregation, the busing of students from east to west and west to east. And some of them were afraid that Cleveland was going to become another Boston, where there would be violence and so forth. You had your financial people that supported the branch. You had some who were in support of what we were doing, and then you had others that called to want to cancel their membership, or those who buy membership every year, so they weren't going to buy a membership anymore. Our life memberships, which are very supportive, at that time they were only $500. That life membership support went down. So we were hit pretty hard financially by the suit, but we knew we were doing the right thing.
Were you approached by any groups or any specific individuals about the NAACP's involvement in this litigation?
Oh yes, the various organizations, various individuals, most of them came prior to this occurring, saying that they were worried that Cleveland was going to be a battlefield, and the East against the West, and the children would be killed, and so forth. But once the suit was filed, it pretty much calmed down, except with me personally, I received hate mail for the next really two years. An interesting thing happened. I used to go to lunch at the Midday Club that was in the Union Commerce Bank building. And the maitre d' of the club was a white fellow, very friendly. And when this was filed, I went to lunch, and he turned his back. And I thought first I thought he was busy or something like that. And another man came up and said, "I'll get your table for you." And so the next time I came here, I did the same thing. And one of the waiters came over and told me that he refused to look at me because I was the president of the NAACP, the father of the segregation suit. That was trivial, but those things happen. And you got your hate mail. And of course, that very year, I was audited by the IRS. That always goes along with it. And then a very interesting thing happened. I got an invitation to speak in Atlanta, Georgia, about what we had done, and for the council, trying to remember the exact name of it, but some council of some affairs. And I went and I spoke, and came back, and 2 days later, my secretary said, Reverend, there's some gentlemen here to see you. And so I came in from the FBI. And so in came the FBI, and they said, I understand, they go all the way around where they're going, and they said, oh, by the way, where were you 3 days ago? Where was I 3 days? I was in Atlanta, Georgia. You were? What were you doing in Atlanta, Georgia? I was there speaking. Were you speaking for the so-and-so in a group? And I said, yes. Do you know that they're a communist organization? And I said, communist organization? I said, the only thing I know, I was on the program with Jesse Jackson and Maynard Jackson, and I named the people that they had me come to speak about Cleveland. Well, we just want to inform you that group that you received $500. And I said, yes, I did. Do you know where that money came from? I said, I have no idea. In fact, I could care less where it came from. I was just glad to receive it. I was, kind of flipped back with them. And they said, the major donor to that organization is so-and-so and so. And what was interesting to show you that the times have changed. They belong to a conservative organization. Now the conservative organizations are the main things going on. So I had all that going. After that, all kind of little things happened to me that way. And then I think you said you were related to them. In 1979, I was transferred from Cleveland to Kansas City. And it was felt by so-called street gossip that the powers that be had got me transferred out of Cleveland because I filed this desegregation suit. And that was not true at all. In fact, it was a major promotion for me. And I, for all kind of reasons, I wanted to see what would happen if I would pastor outside of a city where I wasn't so well known. My father was so well known. And so I went there, and of course, a little week or so after I was there, the mayor of the Kansas City, the police chief, and the superintendent of schools came to the church. And I had a wonderful secretary there, a wonderful lady. But Kansas City still had a little touch of the South. And whenever white people came around, black folk just started trembling. And she came in my office and she said, Reverend, the mayor's here, superintendent of school, the police chief, they want to see you. I said, send them in. And they came and they said, we want to ask you why you're here in Kansas City, and do you intend to file a suit against us? I said, we have a good system here. We have a blah, 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 blah. I said, well, I just got here. I don't know if it's all what you say, and it won't have any problems out of me at all. Coincidentally, that particular year, Kansas City does not recognize Martin Luther King Day. And the schools were not closed. So that was my first thing, and they felt, oh, he's going to do it here too. And I went to the superintendent and I told him what I was going to do. So I'll put you in jail. He shook his finger in my, if you have boycotted my schools, I'll put you in jail. It's against the law, and he read me section so-and-so and so of the Kansas City, that anyone interrupts school day and all that. I said, well, I'll not only go to jail, I said, as you know, I pastor the largest church here in this city, and I pastor the largest AME church in the Midwest. I didn't have 2,000 members at that time, but I said I did. I said, I will not go to jail by myself. I said, because my church is with me 100%. You'll have to arrest 2,000 of us. Well, just the thought of the 2,000 people going to jail. He closed the schools, and that started then Martin Luther King Day. Schools were closed in Kansas City. So I had my time there too.
How long did you stay in Kansas City?
I was there 9 years,
9 years. Okay. Came back to Cleveland.
1989.
Okay.
And went back on the board of the NAACP, which I served to this day. And during 2 occasions, I served as interim director. Pauline Tarver, who was the director, took ill. And they knew she was going to be out for 7 or 8 months. George Forbes was the president. And he called me and said, Charlie, your church is right up the street. It wasn't right up the street, but it wasn't that far. He said, could we get you to come down and look after the NAACP while Pauline is in the hospital? And I did. She was there longer than she thought she was going to be. And then that very next year, she decided to run for judge. And of course, our Constitution states that you cannot run for political office and be in that position. So he asked me to come back. If you recall, I came back and served until I became ill. So I served. I've been president, and I've been interim director twice. And my dad was director. How's that?
And you had a father that was also
Yeah, the director.
paid director.
That's right. That's right.
You may or may not remember this, but your father, while he was on the Board of Education, was adamant about segregated schools in the city of Cleveland. You were just a child at the time, obviously.
No, I was a teenager.
Were you?
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have any conversations with him about the segregated nature of the Cleveland schools?
Yeah, well, there was 2 sides of that. There was 2 sides of that. The reason I was involved in the conversation about segregated schools, when he was a candidate for the school board.
I'm sorry, Reverend. Can you say when, with my father, so we know who you're talking about?
When my father was a candidate for the school board. During those years, because he was involved in the political situation, he ran a number of campaigns. I ran Charlie White's campaign. He ran with Judge Perry B. Jackson, and Councilman Kellogg, and so forth. And it was not unusual for me to see a number of white politicians from Cleveland, the west side, and then if there were county races from the various Bedford, Garfield Heights, Cleveland Heights, and so forth, would show up at the house. And so when he was running, they said, now, your name, my father's name was Charles P. Lucas, Charles Payne Lucas, said, when you go over in Garfield Heights and you had sound trucks in those days. When you go to that area, don't say Charles P. Lucas, say Charles Pulaski Lucas, and you'll get a lot of white votes that way. You know, that was kind of the joke of it. And so, I had to take the joke a little bit further. So my father had these sound trucks, and every Saturday we would go to the communities, vote for Charles P. Lucas for school board, state school board. So we rolled out, and remember those days, when you rolled out to Garfield Heights, that was solid white, and they were all in there. And I wrote, and just for fun, when we went to Garfield Heights, I said, vote for Charles Pulaski Lucas. Well, he carried Garfield Heights, and I said that was because I was the one that put the Pulaski out there. But anyway, when he went on the school board, there was another person that had great influence in my life as well as my father, and that was Adam Clayton Powell. And if you remember, when Adam Clayton Powell was in Congress, he stuck that amendment, the Powell Amendment, on everything that came through as far as, desegregation and so forth. So my father, when he went on the state school board, his main goal was to do something about the segregated Cleveland schools and segregated. He was on state level then. So he was involved in it everywhere. And so when you ask my involvement, I was in it with both feet because something else happened to show you I knew I was a teenager. I used to drive him to state board meetings, and I did it. I had a selfish reason too. That gave me the car for a couple of days, and we would just talk. He would just talk it all the way down, and some of the other members sometimes would ride with us. Or if he was, my father, I really am embarrassed that due to my illness, when I was ill, they moved cartons of my things, but my father was a prolific speechwriter. He typed everything. Every night he would type stuff out. And so he would have his speeches that he was going to make before the school board, and he would read them on the way down. Not so much for me to critique him, but he would, was practicing, so I would hear what he was going to do. And of course, every speech had in Cleveland Public Schools, the segregated east to west.
That's an inspirational story.
Well, that's what happened.
Some of the people that are still around that were involved in the Cleveland schools that you know?
They in that era, with Arnold going, I mentioned Canella, and James Tanner's dead. Charles Jordan, he's dead. Alethea Warren, she's dead. As far as our struggle is concerned, every one of the list of people in Cleveland that were for or against us with that, such as Christopher Salvin, Judge Parker, they're all dead. I can't, offhand, you and I and Jim Stallings, I'll tell you who is, she was the secretary of the branch for a long time, member of Antioch Baptist Church. As well as I know her, I'll think of her name, she's still living. But it's really amazing, the number of people that are, like with Carl is dead, Lou is living, Lou is still here. Carl Carrick's gone, Lloyd Brown. Because a number of so-called black, please, not even so-called, that are politicians today weren't even like Frank Jackson and Jeff Johnson. None of them were really on the scene during that time. I can't think of anybody. George Forbes, of course, he's still living. George, but Carol Hoover. Carol Hoover was interestingly enough, when she first came back to Cleveland, you remember, Jim, we were involved in that conversation. Her job was at the NAACP, and she coordinated our special events, which was the Freedom Fund dinner and so forth. John Buscemani, he's deceased. I'm just thinking person after person. No, Cheryl wasn't even here at that time. No. Father Cooper is dead. Yeah, he's gone. Yeah. The list is. I graduated from Glenville in 1959, and when we have our anniversaries, everyone's always having a great big time. And then they read the list of the deceased. It gets real quiet because so many, have gone on.
So far, your name is not on the list.
Not only just yet, not yet, but it'll be on there someday.
Okay. Let's go off the record.
Did we get that discussion going about the role of the ministers?
No, we didn't. I don't think we got covered that.
All right.
So what was your question?
Again, was there organized support in black faith or in the faith community? Because it could have crossed the color line. Was there organized support in the faith communities for the work of the NAACP?
Thanks, Reverend. Can you look right at
James?
I was going to say Mr. Hardeman.
Go ahead. You gonna ask it?
No, she's already asked a question, you can just.
Oh, I see. Unfortunately, the support was muted for the reasons I mentioned before. A number of the ministers were not for the suit being filed, but there was not so-called an organized group, but they let it be known because our membership went down for the next couple of years. It picked back up, but as I mentioned, they were against it for several reasons. Some because their families, their wives were principals of schools, or they were closed because of the segregation. Some were worried that there would be another riot situation like it was in Boston. And so they were not for it. We had some that were for it and were supportive. So it really went about, I would say it was 30% for and 70% initially. And then as time went on, it got much better. I do want to add to my comments, and not because he's one of the interviewers, but the excellent legal work that we had. James Hardiman put his whole life and soul into the desegregation case. Nate Jones came in from the NAACP. As you know, whenever this happens in the name of the NAACP, the Legal Redress Committee of the NAACP comes in, and they become a part of it. But and they bear some of the finances, but not that much. You have to bear much of it on your own, on the local situation. But we had excellent legal counsel, and that also gave a favorable court ruling to the whole situation. And then, of course, Judge Battisti did an excellent job initially that went on from court to court.
Okay. Anything else? I'm done. Donna?
Well, there's one thing I think about how the desegregation in the north, was possibly perceived. And I think about that too with the meeting that you had with Roy Wilkins. Did it seem as though there was a, connection with other northern cities? Was it an NAACP directive in the north to, to look at segregated schools?
Oh yes, it was. See the
Reverend, before you start,
yeah.
you put the question.
Yeah,
Look right at James.
yeah, the NAACP directive from the national was, I have to put that in parts. First of all, the financial stress of the local branch is also felt nationally. We are not an organization that raises a whole lot of money. The NAACP national staff at that time, I don't think, I might be wrong, but I don't think it was probably more than 15 if it was that, because you had Roy Wilkins as the director, and Henry Moon was head of the Crisis magazine, and Ruby Roxbury was head of branches, and we had a lady from Cleveland, Ethelyn Gorman's sister, Gertrude Gorman, who was the head of branches. I mean, I can almost name the whole national staff. And often when you say NAACP, you think of these like a room after room, Legal Redress Committee. Here in Cleveland, Cleveland has rarely had more than 2 or 3 people in the office. So you say NAACP, you're not talking about a lot of people. So when you have Cleveland filing, this file, that filing, this is a very heavy drain on your national office and also the national finances. So as much as the NAACP was pushing you to segregate your schools, at the same time they knew they could only go so far financially. And at that time you only had one Nate Jones running around from place to place. So part of the reason that you didn't have this overwhelming support for every city to go and file, is they don't have the personnel nor the finances to do it.
Good. That's excellent. Inspirational. Yeah. Of course, it started 40 years ago, but still.
Yeah, you might have a little wait with me. Yeah, they,
I have to say this is a personal note. Your birthday is the same day as my children's father.
oh my,
Date and year.
February 26th. Oh, that's great. How's he doing?
Oh, he's fine. He lives in Columbus. He's from Jamaica. He'll live forever.
Oh, he's not here?
No.
Or you sent him
No,
on
I
his,
left him in Columbus.
you sent him on his way, huh?
No, I came back home.
You-
He wouldn't come.
He's from
to Cleveland.
Jamaica?
Yeah, my children are bicultural.
Oh.
From Jamaica.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And your wife, her people are from Haiti.
No,
Not Haiti,
Jamaica.
I mean Jamaica, rather.
Yeah.
Yes,
Pat. From
yeah, I knew it was someplace, yeah.
Yeah.
Her parents came here.
Well, my wife graduated from high school in Jamaica.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
And Pat,
Don't understand.
she